Welcome everyone to our first new Think Green webinar, which has been pulled together by Ioana Rossi of Kingston Council, members of the Council's Green Task Force and the Kingston Chamber of Commerce. My name is Forbes Lowe and I'm the Chief Exec of the Kingston Chamber. And we're going to start this new series today by exploring the subject of decarbonising transport. Transport is not just how you get around. It is actually something that is very fundamental to the shape of our towns, to our cities, our countryside, our living standards, our health, and our whole quality of life. Decarbonising transport is not about stopping people doing things. It's actually about doing the same things differently. It is also an opportunity to create hundreds of new jobs, skilled jobs, and revitalise the way our Kingston businesses can grow in the coming years. But before we begin, these webinars will be recorded and they will be made available later to share and to catch up. Today, it is a condensed programme, so what I'd be grateful for is if you can put your questions into the chat feature and we will do our best, time permitting, to answer them when we can. And there will be a poll at the end to get your feedback on a number of the issues which have been discussed today. So what I'd like to do with me today is welcome our four business guests who have come to this conversation with the very same convictions, but actually quite different paths, which makes this a very interesting and diverse conversation. And they are Alper Mujuroglu, pardon me, I'm dreadful with names, as anybody knows, Dr. Sarah Wixie, Jade Ebenezer, and Massimo Resta. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Alper. Can you just say a few words, Alper, about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Forbes. Hi, everyone. I run or started a company called Pedal My Wheels, who run a number of cycling initiatives in partnership with local councils, London councils and TfL. In Kingston, we operate a scheme called Try Before You Bike, which is a hire scheme which enables you to try a bike out. You get training with it, and if it's not for you, we come and collect the bike, and if you do want to go for it, you can buy it and you get your hire fees back. And it's all about getting people cycling who aren't currently doing so. Hope that's
Thank
okay.
you, Alper. Sarah Wixie.
Hi, hello everybody. I'm Sarah Wixie and I work for Vertus Energy. Vertus is an EV charging infrastructure company, but I lead on our sustainability initiatives and projects. And these range from sustainable mobility projects to also looking at how to work with businesses to help them become more sustainable and to decarbonise their transport systems.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Jade, welcome.
Good day, everybody. I'm Jade Ebenezer. I've been in the mobility business for circa 16 years. I've worked across a number of transport modes, including car rental, car club, car sharing, bicycle sharing, scooter sharing, and most recently, I represent a business who provides an e-roaming network for EV charging. I'm currently in Berlin at one of our conferences talking exactly this topic. How opportune. Glad to be here.
Lovely to have you and welcome from Berlin. And finally, Massimo. Massimo is probably just catching his breath. We had a few technical issues, but Massimo just made it as the door opened. Welcome, Massimo. And he's on mute.
There you go. Sorry, just in time, I just said. Well, I'm Massimo Resta, one of the partners at Zoo Capital. Zoo Capital is a private equity firm that invests in renewable energy, environmental assets, and EV charging infrastructure. We manage a 420 million fund that is dedicated to public charging infrastructure in the UK, with a very cryptic name, the Charging Infrastructure Investment Fund. So very, very difficult to understand what we do. And we, over the last 6 or 7 years, we backed a number of companies in this space, including Instavolt, EO, Liberty Charge, and Chargy. Essentially, all these companies are installing the charging infrastructure, the public charging infrastructure that is required to support the transition.
Thank you, Massimo. It's we all met up last week to go through the agenda today, and I think the infrastructure element of all of this was particularly enlightening. So we will come on to that a little bit shortly. But again, the whole point of this is to really try to understand what these terms mean. I think there's quite a few of you here today who may be very familiar. There's some less so. So what we're trying to do with these 4 specialists in their different fields is to kind of really dig deeper and trying to understand what are the little mechanisms which make this work and what are the complexities, and just to provide a little bit more information so we can get a better grasp of what, in this example, decarbonising transport actually means. So to begin with this, we're going to start with a simple question really for Sarah, which is, could you summarise really the key objectives and the meaning of decarbonising transport?
Okay, so I think the best way of summarising it is just to go back and quickly give an overview of the UK government's transport decarbonisation plan, because even though it's a really chunky document, it does clearly explain exactly what the government's looking for in terms of decarbonisation and sets out the strategic objectives going forward. So as I said, it's quite a chunky plan. It's 220 pages plus 9 supporting documents, but I'll quickly summarise what the key aims of it are. So essentially what decarbonising all forms of transport means is taking the road sector, rail, maritime, shipping and aviation and active travel and looking at the best ways to remove the fossil fuel elements of them, and to try and do that as soon as possible. Even though the ultimate target is 2050 in some cases, the sooner we can do that, the better. And the way that the government has set that out is they have 6 strategic priorities. The first one is looking at accelerating a modal shift to public and active transport. So it's going back to try and encourage people to use public transport more often, but also to clean that public transport itself, so that we'll see more electric, more hybrid, more hydrogen buses and trains going forward in the future, and to really encourage more active travel, so more walking and cycling. And the intention is that by 2050, half of every journey will be conducted by active travel. So we will be cycling more and we will be walking a lot more in the future. The second point is to decarbonise road transport itself. And you may have heard the government's announcements that as of 2030, you won't be able to buy a new fossil fuel powered van or car. They will all be either electric or hopefully hydrogen will come into that mix. So again, it's removing the fossil fuels from new vehicles going forward. There will be a second-hand market, but ideally that will be wrapped up as soon as possible, and we'll start to see a second-hand EV market emerging very quickly. We also see number 3 is about decarbonising our goods and how we manage our freight system, because there's no point in trying to look at people making their individual journeys and businesses doing everything they can if we're not looking at the freight sector as well. So again, there's a lot of targets for freight operators, for manufacturers of freight vehicles, to try and decarbonise trucks in particular, the heavy sector side of things. And the largest manufacturers have committed to a 2040 target, but ideally working to something a lot sooner. We're also looking at the role of last mile logistics. So again, looking at how can we deliver items on the last mile using active modes. So will there be more people walking deliveries? Will there be more cargo bike deliveries? And it's quite timely that the government has a grant available to businesses to apply for, where they can use the grant towards the cost of an electric cargo bike. And some boroughs are offering electric carrier services as well as for couriers. The fourth point is looking at developing a green transport technology and innovation. So again, we want the UK to be really innovative in this area, to be world leading in what we do and how we decarbonise our power systems, as well as all the modes of transport, how our science and technology and our academics are really sort of championing the way going forward. And that will obviously in turn lead to new innovation, new technology, and a drive for productivity and lead to new jobs. There is a lot of potential for new employment in this area, and we're coming on to that a bit later. The fifth point is about place-based solutions and emissions reductions. So by 2050, every place in the UK will have its own net zero transport network. So locally, the decarbonisation agenda will be working. There will be opportunities for small communities to come together and look at their local infrastructure and what their needs are. And then the final point is reducing carbon in the global economy. So what are we doing about UK aviation? That needs to be net zero by 2040. Our shipping industry needs to be net zero by 2050. And what sort of innovative solutions will those industries come up with? We were already starting to see the first electric microplanes. On the Isle of Wight, we already have the first electric ferry, and those sorts of initiatives coming forward. As well as these strategies, we can start to see that there's co-benefits for other sectors. So in terms of the co-benefits on air quality improvements, health improvements through physical activity, obviously reducing emissions overall for climate change, and then, like I say, that creation of jobs. Just to give you an example from my sector, the Institute of Motor Industry has recognised that we're going to need something like 75,000 mechanics to work on EV vehicles going forward. At the moment, there are only 15,000. So there'll be a huge drive to recruit new mechanics, new technicians to help to support the infrastructure that's being deployed. So I hope that helps in terms of a quick overview of decarbonisation.
No, that's terrific. Thank you very, very much, Sarah. There's a point there you mentioned about sort of making this local, and this is obviously a very local audience. So I think and about the infrastructure of this. So really what I want to get into, which is actually a really key point for a lot of people here, is about the infrastructure of all of this. How does this all kind of click together? And I think there are so many different examples of this. So I'm just going to extend this question in terms of the infrastructure of decarbonising transport is really critical. I just want to kind of hear from your different perspectives how this actually works or doesn't work for you. Can I start with Alper first? Being the cyclist here, I'm sure there's a lot of pros and cons of all of this for you.
Yeah, infrastructure, from our perspective, would be around cycle routes, really, cycle lanes, dare I say it, low traffic neighbourhoods. So basically separating cyclists from motor vehicles. Safety is often cited as the #1 barrier to people cycling. So I think that's the most important thing. Where there's also issues around storage, especially in London. So bike hangars, infrastructure around that. A lot of stuff's gone in over COVID. I mean, some of this stuff's, it can't go in immediately. It takes time. I mean, the hangars is an example. It's often given as a reason I won't get a bike because I can't put it in my flat. Some of this is education, and there's decent bike insurance companies, for example, who will cover your bike if it's left outside, and if you lock it properly and you don't leave it there for days on end, things like this. So sometimes with infrastructure, we're a bit, there's a lot of cycling you can do in London now without more infrastructure. We need more, and to get more people on bikes, definitely, but it's not as bad as sometimes some people say. It's actually, and we find this with our Try Before You Bike scheme, once you're using the bike and you start getting out there, you realise there are a lot of opportunities to cycle where you're separated from motor vehicles. So
you actually mentioned,
at the moment, go on.
So you just mentioned before we came on the fact that you're cycling up to Islington. And can you share the percentage of clear pathways for cyclists? It was much higher than I thought it would be, to be honest.
Yeah. So I'm going from West Norwood to Islington. I'd say 75-80% will be segregated from motor vehicles. So that's a combination of me knowing the route, so going through a canal path, an old canal path, a park, and then once I get more central London, using the segregated paths, Blackfriars Bridge. Like central London's very good, I'd say, for cycle lanes. Yeah, and I think you're right, people don't realise, but it takes actually getting out there to use the bike to understand it, and knowing other people who cycle so they can explain the routes to take and get you off. I still see people around our way riding down the South Circular. There's there's low traffic neighbourhoods they can go through, there's parks they can go through. If you don't know, if you've just gone from a car to a bike, you only know the route you know. So some of a lot of this is information stuff and perception. That's where we come from with this. What will be in terms of infrastructure, we don't have a lot of control over. So we just work with what we've got to work with. And people, the take up from our schemes, and these are generally new cyclists, it's a very high percentage go on to continue cycling. So I would say it's more the experience. Don't stop putting infrastructure in, but yeah, there's stuff out there already.
That's very, very interesting to know. Is there, I mean, you talk to a lot of different boroughs. What do you feel as if there's are people getting really copped on with this, or is there a certain bit of lethargy? What do you think are some of the stumbling blocks?
Right now, there are issues around funding for stuff because of TfL and the whole, without getting into it, the battle between government and TfL, which seems a bit of a political issue. We've got to sort of carry on. So it's difficult for councils because they're ready and raring to go. And there's, the golden age of cycling, £2 billion, and then they're sitting there with no money and letting staff go. So on the one hand, the stuff coming out sounds great. In practice, it's just been, hopefully this will change next year, but in practice, they're also drastically short of funds for stuff, for cycling, amongst other things. So there's that issue. Last year we had a big uptake because of COVID, and people couldn't do a lot else other than go for a walk or bake a banana cake or go for a ride. So cycling had a huge boost, obviously. The numbers orders for us hasn't continued in that vein, which isn't a surprise, but it is still solid. I think we're finding stuff out now. Some people are going back to work. There's a whole host of things with this. It's like we deal on an individual basis. Like, what is your problem? Why can't you cycle? It's things like, I don't know, school runs, and they've got to carry their kids' tennis rackets and sports equipment and things. So the schools need to put more lockers. There's a whole, what does the person have to do once they've dropped their kid off? Where have they got to go and work, etc., etc. So it's all things that are really easily fixed, I'd say, but it does need a sort of bigger overview. Councils generally are, they saw increased numbers. And then there's been the pushback on certain things. It is tricky. I mean, I come at from this viewpoint. I try not to get too involved in the arguments over LTNs and all this sort of thing. The starting point is we've exceeded the air pollution levels legally in London, and there's a climate emergency. If everyone who's involved agrees with that, be it a business or, that's the starting point. So it's no good saying, don't put LTNs in, for example. What do you do? Like, LTNs to me are minor. That's nothing compared to what we're going to have to do to combat this. A whole raft of measures. LTNs is fairly insignificant in the whole range of things we're going to have to do. So as long as we keep coming back to, there is a climate emergency, we are exceeding air pollution levels, what do we do? And I'm not saying for a second, everyone, despite my t-shirt saying it, everyone gets on a bike, not at all. I think we should segregate walkers from cyclists in a lot of cases. You go through parks, if you're walking, it's quite uncomfortable having a bike coming up at speed and it ruins the walk, you know? So
there's some really interesting points there. Yes, but I think it's encouraging, as you say, that there is 75% of that journey. So there has been a change, but obviously there's so many other details along that route which do make a big difference. Can I bring in Jade now? Jade, your perspective of this in terms of the infrastructure for decarbonising transport from your side, where does this kind of work or not?
Absolutely. I mean, if we look at this specifically from an EV perspective, currently the portfolio that I'm busy in, the Climate Committee, who essentially provides advice to government with regard to infrastructure, tells us that by 2025, we will need circa 150,000 charge points in the UK at a bare minimum, followed by in the region of 280,000 charge points by 2030. The reality is where we stand right now is that we have active charge points in the region of 30,000 right now, which shows you how big the gap is between expectation and reality and what we need to deliver. As it stands right now, the biggest blocker to EV adoption is essentially range anxiety. Now, that's really curious if you consider that some of your better vehicles or EV vehicles these days are able to travel in excess of 350 miles on a single charge, which makes it really interesting. The flip side to all of this is that EV infrastructure is extremely expensive, and it's finding that balance in terms of partnership between private and public enterprise to ultimately drive the create the correct ecosystem that ultimately enables EV adoption, because that's what we're trying to do in terms of decarbonizing the network.
Thank you. Is there a sense that there's a comment, ZAP map is great, AS is a charge card. Is there sort of a bit of hostility towards that sort of revolution to a degree, because it's such a change and we only feel as if it's like 3-4 years away? Is there sort of, yeah, I can understand that rage element.
I think you're spot on. You know, I think with new technologies, there certainly is a period whereby you have to manage expectations and specifically relate to change management. We know this, we're creatures of habit, and people are reluctant to try new things. In many cases, these new things could be better for them, effectively saving them money in the long run. But there certainly is that element. You know, I think as EVs become more affordable and they become more mainstream, we are seeing fantastic numbers in terms of units sold year on year versus ICE or internal combustion engines, which certainly is driving sentiment in the right way. The fact that the major vehicle manufacturers globally have spent considerable amounts of monies in retooling their plants and bringing forward new models is certainly a sign of the times. It's easy to switch on the radio or have a look at the telly to be bombarded by adverts around electric vehicles, you know, and we should see mass adoption, or at least a momentous shift in the coming years, which effectively will drive the industry.
Interesting. Massimo, just taking one step slightly back from that position, Massimo, you kind of, we had a very interesting conversation about the infrastructure, and there's several various points which you made about this, because really that's almost one of the big questions is how on earth does this actually roll out? So from an investment point of view, can you kind of take a step right back from the beginning and see how this works?
Sure, but let me just say something to Jade. You're right that the infrastructure is expensive, but the good thing is that there are companies out there that are willing to finance and build this infrastructure and run it for you. So you know, most of the business don't really need to worry about that, right? So how the infrastructure works. First of all, let's step a second back and say decarbonizing transport means, to a large extent, transitioning to electric vehicles, right? Now, for people to buy electric vehicle, you need a reliable public charging infrastructure, because nobody's going to buy a car that can only be charged at home, right? And public charging infrastructure is essentially, you have probably seen along our streets these days, they are popping everywhere. There are these chargers that essentially is a piece of equipment, and you can think of it as a glorified socket. But it's a lot more than that, right? It's not only the infrastructure that goes into the ground, but there is also an infrastructure in the cloud, the software that runs it. That is very important, if not even more important, right? So whenever you think about this infrastructure, it's probably better to rely on professional companies that will install and run it for you. Because otherwise you will need to take care of all the software updates that will make it possible for these chargers to talk to the cars. You will need to deal with the customers that will make payment through these chargers. That you will need to deal with them when they have a problem. So you will need to have a customer service. So it is a very complex type of infrastructure, and there are companies that are specialized and will install it and run it and build it for you. And most of these companies will have a very simple business model. They will secure the rights on the parking base over long terms from the host. That could be a local authorities, a restaurant, a hotel. They will secure the rights and they will build and run the infrastructure. And that would be beneficial for the host, because that will drive traffic into the business of the host, right? Being a restaurant, for example, people will drive there because they know that while they're eating, they can recharge their car. So it is an opportunity for most businesses, but I would encourage them not necessarily to do it on their own. Does that answer your question, folks?
Operator error. Thank you, Massimo. There's a question actually for Jade, which is regarding the EV batteries lasting approximately for 10 years. Is that correct?
I'd hate to be able to quote a verified source. There's obviously a range of variables with regard to batteries as well as manufacturers. I assume under different circumstances and different stress loads, you're likely to get a different result. Effectively, they should be lasting longer, is what I should say.
Thank you. Sarah, when we were talking about this the other day, we were talking a little bit about sort of disabilities as well. And I know this is a very important part of your work because this comes into the infrastructure as well. Can you elaborate a little bit more on this? Because it was a fascinating kind of insight, which quite a few of us don't appreciate, I think.
Yeah, so later, towards the end of this year, Motability and the British Standards Institute will be producing some new guidance and standards for EV charging infrastructure companies and EV vehicle manufacturers on how to ensure better accessibility for disabled people to access charging infrastructure. From my experience over the last couple of years, what I've noticed is when looking at planning applications, for example, the parking spaces for the disabled users tend to be close to the entrance of the facility, and yet all the charging infrastructure tends to be in a different part of the car park. I mean, I can just think of my local Sainsbury's where that happens. So the disabled person has to decide, do they want to charge their car or do they want to have access to the facility? And it really, going forward, we should be designing charging infrastructure that is accessible for everybody, regardless of ability. And looking at some of the new charging designs that are coming out, they look quite nice, they look quite fancy, but when the visual display board is significantly higher than somebody's sitting in a wheelchair, that it's not accessible for them to use. And we need to look at the barriers around the charging infrastructure, because again, is that preventing someone from being able to access the cabling points? And this is an area that's been completely overlooked. And we're starting to see planning applications that don't consider this. And yet, once those applications are built out, they'll be built on the old principles of the infrastructure. And really, we need to get that embedded now. And we also need to look at the volume of accessible charging points in applications, because quite often you'll see there is a requirement to have X number of parking spaces, but it doesn't say what percentage of those parking spaces for EV users need to be accessible for disabled people. Again, if they're made accessible for everybody, then it solves a problem going forward in the future, but it's a problem we shouldn't be having at the moment. And I think one of the main contributory factors to that is we don't have a national strategy for EV infrastructure. Each local authority does their own thing. Each local authority has its own policies and guidance. And what I think is needed going forward is some sort of national infrastructure strategy where we can discuss all the pros and cons of this.
Thank you, Sarah. That's, I'm going to slightly segue here, but just to ask the group, that element of local decisions and nationals, just out of curiosity, is there sort of a place, a country which you think, do you know, actually they're taking big strides, they're leading the way? Are there any good examples where you could say that they're doing this really kind of quite well, they're joined up? I give that to the floor, to be honest. Does anybody want to? If I just ask a very dead question, I don't know.
No, for me, I personally like what's happening in Norway, because to me, they are the leaders in this area in terms of what they're delivering on the ground, but also the design of some of their products is very accessible.
Well, I tend to agree that the Nordics are leading the way. They have a penetration of EV of almost 50%, right? It helps that they are not 60 million, let me put it this way, but you know, they're definitely leading the way in Europe.
Interesting. Jade, from your viewpoint in Berlin.
I mean, the Germans, if we look at electric batteries, you take it back to e-bikes, I think they were responsible for the largest number of units shifted over the past 5 years. In addition, with regard to charge points, I'm certain they represented with the most dense network in all of Europe. More importantly, what you find in Germany, or specifically Berlin, is collaboration between many charge point operators. Without selling a product, at Hubject, what we essentially do is we provide a platform that enables any user to use a single contract to be able to charge across a number of networks. And what we see on that is that creates a better customer experience by not having to keep 10 different cards, 5 different apps in order to conduct a journey cross country. And more importantly, it allows the different operators to capitalize on utilization, which essentially, again, drives EV adoption by making it cheaper to operate these charge point units and creating a better customer experience for EV drivers. Thank
you very much. I always tend to think that it's always good if there's something which you can aim at, if there's a model you can target. I think that always helps us to kind of define these things a little bit more. Really, the next question really comes into what opportunities might arise for local businesses from the process of decarbonising transport in the long term or in the short term. So we're taking it from a much broader view. How can we scale this down to make this kind of more accessible to local businesses? Ms. Simo, can I start with you first on that one?
Well, yeah, well, you know, that's pretty simple. Let's think about hotel, shops, restaurants. They could install EV chargers and attract more clients, more customers that will recharge their car while they're doing their shoppings or while they're sleeping in the case of a hotel, right? And that is not going to be, in many cases, it's not going to be it's not going to involve any capital expenditure on this business, because as I said, there are companies that are willing to build and run this this infrastructure for them. So it is a mutually beneficial relationship between the so-called charge point operator and the business. And then clearly there are some other opportunities of companies that are willing to enter in this sector and and provide some services like installation services for the companies that own this infrastructure, as opposed to operational management services or other services more generally, like technology services. They could launch a business that provides some piece of equipment. These are, I would say, the first things that come to mind.
Thank you. And Jade, from a maybe slightly smaller scale, what are your thoughts with this?
Absolutely, just echoing with what Massimo said. So I was part of the founding team that set up one of the first car clubs, as well as bicycle sharing schemes in the UK. And the learnings clearly were local first. I think if you can take those procurement of services or products to the local area where you operate in, that is highly beneficial. So rather than trying to import spare parts in, looking for a local manufacturer to retool and supply those parts, looking for mechanics within your local network as apprentices, and ultimately collaborating with the community. If there's anything I've learned through the sustainability journey, is how important community is. If you start with the community and work backwards, you certainly set up a good foundation for a long-term sustainable business.
Thank you. And I'm thinking directly with Kingston, with the university, the colleges and the education. I would have thought, Sarah, that this is a really key point, that if you can embed this in for the skill set at that generation, it really is a fantastic platform to start there, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's great that we have academics in the webinar today who can help to build that going forward, because it's like the example I gave earlier. The Institute of the Motor Industry has highlighted a significant skills gap to be able to service all of these EV vehicles going forward in the future. But there's also huge opportunities to get involved in some really innovative and exciting new technologies. So, for example, looking at hydrogen as an example, we will be looking to have hydrogen as a fuel source for our homes and businesses in the future. And yet at the moment, we don't have the infrastructure in place. We have a hydrogen strategy that will hopefully address that. But again, what kind of jobs will be needed for that? What courses will the universities and the colleges need to deliver to enable the individuals to work in that sector going forward? And the one area that is still required is substantial government funding to support the skills sector going forward, to develop the relevant courses and to deliver the training, and not just at the apprentice level, but throughout the entire education chain.
So from that point of view, it really is about, as you referred to before, the strategy has to be so national. The local area can try and engineer a certain amount, but it's really got to come from the top, doesn't it?
I think to have, we need the national strategies for infrastructure such as hydrogen and electric vehicle charging, etc., but then filtered down to the local level, but to use this similar standards going forward, because otherwise you're going to end up with confusion about what you can do in one location that you can't do in another. And as a EV user, it will be confusing in terms of what's likely to be available going forward.
Thank you, Sarah. There's a lot of very interesting conversations going on in the chat, which is one eye listening and following the chat. So it's great that everybody's really contributing here with this. It's terrific. The next question really is, and I'm going to start with Alper and then go back to Massimo on this, is there is a general perception, I think, that transitioning to a green economy is expensive. Can we afford it? And particularly as we're coming out of this godforsaken awful period. Alper, I suspect that you would just say a bike is actually very cheap. but just on a broader level, is this a fair perception to make?
Is it a fair perception? I'm not sure. I mean, I'm a small business owner, so I think any sort of enforced change, a business tends to react negatively. They'll look at it as a cost. Removing or making it more difficult for people to drive, they look at that as a cost because they'll have customers who drive, whereas there's other ways of looking at it, isn't there? You could encourage more customers by going green, being eco, sort of using it as a PR exercise. So I think, yes, it is initially looked at because it's an enforced cost as expensive. I mean, we've got electric vehicles, for example. When I first got them, and that's for delivering bikes, 4 years ago when we first started using them, it was a lot more expensive than using a diesel van. We're the nature of our business, it lends itself to that, so it was worth us doing. In terms of bikes, I don't know, I have this thing with businesses, it's really tricky. We've had 2 years of council sort of pushing cargo bikes on businesses and get them to use cargo bikes and grants for cargo bikes, and it's, I don't know, sometimes I think it's a little bit misdirected. If you walk down a high street, they don't necessarily need cargo bikes, they don't even do deliveries. There's other ways of doing it. We're just partnering with a new scheme we're doing with a shop in East Dulwich, in a high street there, where they're taking ownership of a cargo bike, but we're using smart technology so they can let their customers use it. So for one, their customers can buy in bulk from them because they can load up the cargo bike. And also it's a good PR exercise for them. I mean, there's all this, I'm totally on board. Like I said, we use electric vehicles, but as Sarah said right at the beginning, the target is 50% of in towns and cities of active travel journeys. That doesn't even bring cars into it. This is walking and on bikes. So I think if you look at it, right, where we are now, that many people drive, let's go electric, that it's not going to be like that. I don't think that we won't recognize how we get about in 20 years time. It's going to be so different. And I suppose in terms of it being a cost, I look at it that I had a previous business in the late 90s in the internet, and it was these sort of conversations around, I don't know, take the fashion industry. No one's ever going to go online to buy clothes. They need to come and try it on. Things are going to change. It's going in that direction now. So it's very much, you got to take a step back, I think, as a business and say, look, this is going to happen because there's no choice. It's just how drastic it is and when it happens. Do we embrace it and look at all these new opportunities, or do we dig in and say, no, I need people to drive to come to me, and I don't want to change things, and it's going to happen. So I believe, so you've got to go along with it in that sense. And electric vehicles are double the range from 4 years ago. We save a lot of money on our journeys by using electric vehicles through not getting diesel. Charging points, we've got them installed in our business, which there were grants for. So there's a whole lot of stuff happening. I might sound a bit over positive with all this, but yeah, it works for us using electric vehicles as well as cargo bikes, as well as bikes.
Thank you, Alper. I was thinking before I came on, sort of, I'm a generation who used to fly and used to be on a plane. And if you wanted to be in the smoking section, you pulled the curtain back and there was just this smoke. And I kept thinking, what on earth were we thinking? Actually flying, petrol, smoking, not a good idea. And just how we have moved, and we have these shifts of thinking, just, no, we're not doing that. And I think this is going to repeat, hopefully in shorter terms, shorter timeframes. Massimo, can you quickly answer the?
Yeah, but I would say it's actually the opposite, right? So let's take a step back. We're transitioning, we're decarbonizing the economy because, it is costing us our planet, right? To make an example, nobody likes to go to the dentist, right? But you have to go to the dentist if you want to avoid, unpleasant implications, right? And this is where we are. Some of the costs are just not internalized at the moment, but as a society, we are paying for those costs. And the government, with all these policies that are putting in place, are trying to internalize these costs and make people aware that we need to get on with these transitions. And for businesses, either they adapt, since consumers are getting conscious about that, if they don't adapt, it might well be that in the future they will lose their clients because maybe they don't want to source their products from companies that are not environmentally conscious. And the same is true for financiers. These days, people don't want to invest in businesses that are not particularly, that do not take into consideration environmental and social and governance criteria in the way they run business. So it is really, I wouldn't call it the cost, I would call it something that we need to do that might generate opportunities for this business because people are conscious about this problem and might prioritize businesses that are also conscious.
I think that's a really important point to make about almost accreditation. That is how your business will be viewed upon in terms of what are your credentials. And I think for local supply chain, I think this is a really key point you've made there. Sarah, is there anything you want to pick up on what Massimo just said there about that supply chain and that almost accreditation?
Yeah, one of the first things that I was thinking of is there's an organisation called the Supply Chain Sustainability School, which helps SMEs in particular to develop their environmental credentials. The services are free, you can join as a member, but you still have access to all the free services. And then also the UK Climate Hub has a net zero campaign at the moment, and it's run by the government and it's free. There's lots of advice, guidance and tools available for people to be able to sign up and make use of to help them with their accreditation journey. And then the other one, which is something we've just submitted to, is B Corp as a way of proving your ability to be a very sustainable company going forward. I'm sorry, the last one I was just thinking of is Planet Mark. Again, they offer accreditation program, but that's just focusing on net zero emissions. But so there are quite a few out there, and I'll pop some links into the chat now if anyone's interested.
You read the chat feature. There's a question, could you put the links into the chat? Mystic Meg has got nothing on you, I think, so that'd be great. Thank you, Sarah. We're kind of zooming through this. I'd like to get into our final question. I'll start with Jade with this one, which is really talking about skills and capabilities. Would you just, as a kind of a sign off to today's session, is kind of, what would you say are the 3 key skills that a business needs to acquire for this successful transition? What kind of the mindset should we get ourselves into? So I'll ask this to each of you, but I'll start with Jade. Kind of 3 kind of key skills, do you think?
Yeah, you touched on it earlier, Forbes, with regard to change management, being able to have a new approach and an approach based on science and sustainability. I think lots of businesses would need to actively get out of their comfort zones in terms of looking at new technologies and new solutions and how that could impact their business positively, as well as the environment, is certainly key in all of this. A collaborative approach, I think, again, I touched on that early, that's essentially what's going to drive this journey for us, and that's working with different partners across the board, collaborating at different touch points, and ultimately building these supply chains and new products. I think if you consider those 2 factors alone, that should be enough to set you up for success. So ultimately, it's a willingness to find out about how new technologies can serve your business positively, as well as the environment. It's about taking a collaborative approach by working with partners and other stakeholders to ensure that what you deliver is best in class, and just getting it done, I suppose. I think lots of people are hesitant to take the first steps, but we all know that in order to eat an elephant, you start by one step or one bite, and that's ultimately what you need to do I understand that this can be overwhelming for many, you know, but it's about taking those first steps and actually doing.
Good advice there about the small steps, and I think this is sometimes can be quite overwhelming, and I just think just make a start. Like anything in life, make a start. Alper, what kind of 3 skills or approach do you think could work here?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Jade said there. Collaborative, definitely. I had flexibility for one. We're in a huge period of change from around transport, but in a whole host of things. So yeah, just be ready to like try things out. There are opportunities for stuff. I'll come back to our scheme, but using bikes and cargo bikes, you haven't got to necessarily buy one, so it's a low level investment. I think a positive outlook on this, there's different ways of looking at it, you know. This for me is huge opportunities, and I look at it quite positively, because the whole thing around air pollution and climate change, it only works with a collaborative approach, which we haven't really had for many years. So to succeed, we're going to have to do that, which I think is going to have huge impact on us, just on our psyche, from having to, if we start succeeding in this, it could have an amazing impact. That to me is very positive. And be open-minded about stuff. Don't dig in. You know, business is changing. I think High Street, from having such a tough time over the last few years, possibly from COVID, with a more of a sort of this hyper-localization idea, it could be a real boon for the High Street, and embracing that and looking at different things. Like I said, I'm not trying to sell our stuff, but a cargo bike share scheme is something this particular business, the first one we're partnering, wouldn't have considered. They're not even going to deliver. They don't do deliveries. They're still getting an electric cargo bike parked outside their shop with their branding on, that parents can use, other businesses can use, individuals can use, not only to shop with them, but to use that high street, make it a nicer place. And rather than them sitting there, and this person was very vocal anti-LTN in this case, she's the business owner is happy to have her name on this electric cargo bike. So it's bringing these people in to realize the opportunities rather than just digging in because it's change. So yeah, that's where I'd come from. Flexibility and positivity.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alper. Massimo.
Well, I think I'm going to repeat part of the things that have been already said, but let me put it this way. First of all, you need to accept that you need to change. Everyone needs to change, right? You need to get into that mentality that the status quo is not okay. Mm-hmm. Secondly, you need to be bold and set yourself a target. Look at your business, get a bold target. I want to reduce my carbon footprint by X%, 50%, 100%, something like that. And then drive the implication, right? Work through the implication and try to achieve that, because without a target, you're never going to do it. You will lose drive at some point. And finally, communicate what you're doing to the wider world so that you can pull other people to do the same, and you can actually receive the benefit of the effort that you're doing, because people will appreciate and will, maybe come to you as opposed to your competitors that they see is maybe not doing the right thing, right? So embrace and drive the transition. That's very inspiring, right?
Thank you, Massimo. Definitely embracing. That's very good. Finally, Sarah, just your final words on this.
Yeah, I agree with what the other guys have said. And I think for me, is to keep speaking to people and hearing about what they're doing, learn from their mistakes, learn from their successes, and also to, like Massimo said, to communicate what you're doing, but also publicize your case studies and share that information more widely, so that you can clearly show people that you've tried something and it did or didn't work. And then also, I think, make use as much as possible of any government funding or free tools, free advice that are being put out there at the moment. Because of COP26 being just around the corner, there is so much more emphasis on us trying to be demonstrating what we're doing. And the government is issuing quite a lot of funding and grants and availability. It's also worth having keeping an eye on some of the research programs as well. So could some of the businesses take part in Innovate UK funded projects or KTN funded projects, because there's quite a few grants available. So make it clear to organisations who would typically bid for that funding that you're interested in potentially trialling or implementing some of the solutions that they might be working on.
Thank you, Sarah. Terrific. I feel as if there's a lot of engagement on the chat. It's interesting seeing the dynamics going on. I think it picks up a lot of what you've been saying, and I think this is really just going to be a start to a lot of this conversation. It's really not easy to summarize, but I think you've all given a really good overview and just given us some insights to the complexity of it, but also given us that sense of we can try and change this. We don't have to be rabbits in a headlight. We can make a difference, and it doesn't have to be a big thing. It doesn't have to be to go out to get your new electric car. There are some much smaller incremental steps that businesses and individuals can take. Thank you very, very much.